Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
There is, across the country, some upheaval going on as the Trump administration works to reduce the size of federal government. Whether you support that effort or oppose it, you can't deny there's not upheaval going on. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. That upheaval has hit all federal government agencies. At the National Park Service, seasonal ranger job offers were rescinded back in January. Roughly 1,000 probationary employees were fired on Valentine's Day, and another 700 to 1,000 Park Service employees took up the administration's offer to resign now, but stay on the payroll through the end of the fiscal year in September. And this week, the Park Service and other government agencies are expected to send their plans for a reduction in force to the administration. To discuss these developments and their implications, I've invited Rick Mossman, president of the Association of National Park Rangers, to join me. I'll be back in a minute with Rick.
Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Rick.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, appreciate it. I wish it was better times, better conversation.
So do I.
As we all know, there's a little upheaval going on across the country and downsizing, and we're going to get into that. You're the president of the Association of National Park Rangers. What is the Association of National Park Rangers?
The Association of National Park Rangers was started back in 1977. A number of rangers within the National Park Service. We move around park to park, so we know people all across the country who we've worked with in various parks. And in 1977, 33 rangers got together in Jackson, Wyoming, just to talk about work and have some fun. And when they did that, they said, we ought to meet every year. And because they were in Jackson, Wyoming, and of course the old Mountain Man rendezvous from the 1800s took place south of Jackson there a ways. And they decided to meet every year, and it turned into what we call our Ranger Rendezvous, kind of based on a Mountain Man rendezvous. It's a kind of a social event, but we also bring in a lot of speakers and talk about work and what's the latest and greatest and that sort of thing. And almost every year we've been doing this for 47 years now, and almost every year we're able to get the director of the Park Service there. We've had the Secretary of the Interior, a lot of authors and other folks associated in some form or manner with the national parks. And we're basically an advocacy group for the national parks and especially the national park employees, all employees of the National Park Service. We represent them, and we advocate for the national parks and the employees.
When you say you advocate for all the employees, custodians, backcountry rangers, wildlife biologists?
You bet, everybody, because I'm a firm believer that everybody that works for the National Park Service is a ranger. Almost everybody wears green and gray. It may be a maintenance uniform, it may be a interpretive or law enforcement ranger uniform, but we're all rangers. We're all there to support the park and keep these wild places and wild things intact forever, unimpaired for the future of all generations, as is our mission and always has been our mission. It was interesting when I was in Africa last summer for 3 weeks, traveling around World Ranger Day, talking to rangers in parks in Uganda, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I asked this one ranger in Uganda at Queen Elizabeth National Park, "How many rangers do you have in this park?" He says, "We have almost 500." And I go, "Wow, 500?" He goes, "Yes, we have ranger accountants, we have ranger bookkeepers, we have ranger interpreters, we have ranger conservation officers." And it was refreshing to hear somebody from a country like that to say that, because we feel the same way, our organization, that all employees are critical to the mission of the National Park Service.
And at the same time, when you look out across the world and the many national parks and protected areas, they don't all have the ranger resources that they could use. I know some years ago, my wife and I went down to Belize and we went to Chiquibu National Park, which is right on the border of Guatemala. And they don't have near enough rangers that they need to protect that place. And there was a lot of problems with incursions coming in from Guatemala, whether they wanted to clear cut a little area and have their own little farm inside Chiquibu National Park, or whether they were mining for gold or poaching wildlife. And so it's a real, I'm not sure everybody appreciates how fortunate the national park system is in the United States to have the ranger force to protect those resources and to make sure that the visitors have a great time in knowing as much about nature, as much about the park as possible, and how to stay safe doing it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We are very fortunate in this country. I really came to that realization. I might add, our Association of National Park Rangers in 1993, we partnered with the English Countryside National Park Rangers and the Scottish National Park Rangers to form the International Ranger Federation. And the International Ranger Federation is basically a body of ranger associations from around the world. We have over if I remember correctly, about 80 countries of the world, almost half the world's countries have ranger associations as part of our International Ranger Federation. And we meet every 3 to 4 years somewhere in the world, again, to discuss, like our Ranger Rendezvous, to discuss ranger issues worldwide, come up with a mission statement for rangers worldwide, and try to work together. We try to do what we can, since we're one of the richest countries in the world, to help support those rangers in other countries through various things and help professionalize them. But yeah, a lot of places, they have it really rough. When I was in the Congo last summer, we had a barbecue on World Ranger Day with about 30 of the rangers there and 10 of the widows and orphans from rangers there. The number of rangers that are killed there in the Congo every year is just is heartbreaking, killed by both poachers and rebel insurgents. We lose worldwide about 160 rangers a year worldwide in the line of duty, most of them in Africa and Asia for the most part, but throughout the world.
Now, looking back at the United States, I mean, the National Park Service has, depending on what month it is and whether the seasonals are on force, maybe 20,000 employees or so. Are they all members of ANPR, or how does that
No,
work?
they're not. We're always taking members. To be honest, we probably haven't done as good a job as we can. Especially a lot of the newer, younger folks don't know who we are or exactly what we stand for. But over the years, I wanted to make the point that over the years, some of the things the association has done to support employees, and some of this goes way back, but like in 1989, during the I'm just trying to think here. The presidential administration, it would have been Reagan or George Bush Sr. But in any case, they raised the rents in federal housing within parks in some places like Yosemite as much as 400%. And we went to Congress and testified and got those rents reduced because, it's just not right or even legal for that matter to raise rents 400% overnight. And at that time, we had one of the examples, we had an employee in New England who was required to live in the house in the park, and he had to pay 53% of his gross income, his government check, to pay for that rent in the park he was living in. And we got that reversed. And in the early 1990s, we got a number of field rangers went back to work in Washington, which in the past, a lot of the folks that worked in the Washington office had not been field rangers and had always been told, well, you can't change this, you can't change that. Well, they went back and were able to work with the Office of Personnel Management, rewrite the ranger positions. And as a result, we got major, at that time, pay increases and benefits that we didn't receive before, especially the protection rangers. The protection rangers are the rangers that do all the emergency services, the law enforcement, the search and rescue, wildland fire, structural fire, emergency medicine, that sort of thing. And a lot of people don't realize that the protection rangers go through the same exact training as Secret Service agents, Capitol Police, Park Police, Border Patrol, et cetera, the same training and have to keep up that training. So they have the same authority, just our jurisdictions within the national parks. I want to throw out one other statistic that I just find astounding that a lot of people don't realize. I started my career in the Park Service in 1979 as a permanent employee. And in 1980, I can remember that we had about 290 units of the National Park Service at that time and about 100 million visitors. And at that time, we had 1,500 permanent rangers to cover the 80 plus million acres of land in the 290 plus parks and deal with 100 million visitors. And we had about 1,000 to 2,000 seasonal protection rangers. Last year, 2024, we now have 433 units of the National Park Service, so it's increased 25 to 30%. We had 316 million visitors, so our visitation has tripled. And the number of protection rangers we have right now is 1,200, less than we had almost 50 years ago. And the number of seasonals we have is less than 400. So our ranger force has decreased dramatically, even though the number of park units has gone up by almost a third, and the number of visitors has gone up by 200% basically.
Yeah, yeah, and actually, the visitation's probably gone up higher. It leaked out the other day. The National Park Service, for some reason, did not see it fit to announce this, but in 2024, there was a record 331.9 million visitors to the national park system. Popular places.
Yes, yes, and unfortunately, the ranger staffs have always been understaffed, and it hurts me. I take it personally when I hear all these recent comments by various Congress people and so forth about federal employees and how they don't work very hard and this and that. I can honestly say that, I spent 36 plus years working all over the country in various parks, and I did it as a mission. And the one thing I will say about National Park Service employees, whether they're a clerk in an office somewhere or a ranger out in the field, almost everybody that works for the National Park Service is mission oriented. They want to work for the National Park Service. The National Park Service is the fourth lowest paid federal agency on average in the country. And people don't work for the National Park Service for the money. We work because we believe in the mission and want to protect these places forever. And, I don't think all federal agencies can say that by any means, but that's certainly true about us. And the National Park Service employees are dedicated public servants to protect these places and to serve the visitor who we work for.
Right, right. Now, as you indicated, you're retired from the Park Service now, but you spent almost 4 decades in the park system, and it wasn't just at one park, was it? You traveled around, you saw a lot of different landscapes and a lot of different issues across the park system, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. I grew up in Kansas and got a degree in wildlife biology from Kansas State University. And while I was in college, I worked at Buffalo National River in Arkansas, which had just been created by Congress 2 years earlier as a new park area. So it was interesting to watch a new park develop. And then my first permanent job after college was as an interpreter at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., where I gave talks about the assassination of President Lincoln. And from there, I went on to Bandelier National Monument in northern New Mexico, Grand Canyon National Park, Wrangell St. Elias and Glacier Bay in Alaska, and then to Yellowstone National Park, and then as Chief Ranger at Wind Cave National Park in the beautiful Black Hills of South Dakota, and a couple acting assignments as superintendent there at Wind Cave and Fort Laramie in Wyoming. So yeah, I got a chance to see a lot of part of the country. I like to tell people I got to work in natural areas, recreation areas, historic areas, all the various types of national park units.
Yeah, wow, that's quite a travel plan you had there, and some beautiful places. Really
And
interesting.
I'm still connected with the National Park Service because since I retired, I went to work as in Colorado for a while as director of one of the National Park Service certified park ranger law enforcement academies. And a lot of people don't realize with the National Park Service is the only federal agency that hires seasonal law enforcement officers. And to qualify for one of those jobs, you have to go to one of the approved academies. It has to be approved by both the National Park Service and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And there's only 6 of those academies in the country. And after I retired, I went to work as the director of the one in Colorado, and then about 6 years moved to Skagit Valley College up here in Mount Vernon, Washington State.
So, Rick, as I'd mentioned in the introduction or in our earlier conversation, there's a lot of upheaval going on across the country. Whether folks agree with it or not is beside the question. The fact remains that there have been a lot of impacts to the National Park Service. Specifically, we had seasonal ranger jobs rescinded, and then on Valentine's Day, 1,000 probationary employees were fired. Since then, the Park Service has been tasked with coming up with a reduction in force plan. Supposedly, the Interior Secretary reversed course on the seasonals and said that the Park Service could hire 7,500. I'm not sure where that stands. Communications with the National Park Service have kind of ceased while the new administration gets its footing. You spent 36 years with the Park Service. Many years since then, you've still connected with the Park Service in one form or fashion. Can you ever recall a time when there was so much, and I think upheaval is a good word to explain it.
No, it is. I like to use the word chaos. Everything's very chaotic right now throughout the government. I have not seen anything like this in my lifetime. I was on a conference call the other day with some of my mentors who are, in their mid 80s, and they also said they've never seen anything like this in their lifetime. Over the years, there's been challenges here and there with various presidential administrations, but nothing like we see now. As you mentioned, we have not been able to get good answers from the National Park Service either. I think my speculation is to some degree that, they've been told basically to be quiet about all this stuff. People are trying to be very careful with the willy-nilly firing of people throughout the government right now. I think people are a bit nervous about speaking out or anything. And we're happy to speak out as an advocate for the National Park Service and National Park employees. They've been very unfairly treated, and as have a lot of government employees, but we're specifically talking about national park employees here. And as you mentioned, they get away with all the seasonals, and then now they've said they're going to hire them back. What a lot of people don't realize is the hiring process takes a long time. It starts in September, and the parks get their what are called certificates of names of people they can hire usually in January, and they start making job offers because the background checking process takes a long time, and a lot of that's due to after 9/11, Congress put a lot of rules and regulations into place on background checks, so it takes a long time to do those. For law enforcement commission rangers, they have to go through an extensive background check to get their law enforcement commission, and it takes months and months. And my fear right now is that a lot of those certificates, they're only good for like 90 days or something. I can't remember the exact amount. And so now they're having to start the hiring process all over again. And my biggest fear for this summer is that they're not going to be able to get even though if they can hire these seasonals, they're going to have a very hard time getting many on by the time the season starts. And I think you're going to see very long lines at the national parks. I heard last week there was a wait of a month and a half or an hour and a half at the entrance station to get into Grand Canyon. And having worked at Grand Canyon in the past, I can tell you that February is, one of the lowest visited months during the year. So I'm afraid you may see wait times at Grand Canyon come June of 4 or 5 hours just to get through the entrance station into the park.
Wow.
And they're going to have a hard time getting enough seasonals on duty for the summer because of because of the hiring process.
Yeah, and I tried to get some clarification on that from Washington, and I didn't get clarification. And the question is, can they just pick up where they left off, or as you indicated, they might have to go back to square one and start all over? Getting those certificates, looking at them, deciding which individuals you want to interview and maybe offer a job to. And if they have to go back to square one, as you indicated, that doesn't happen overnight. The process.
Absolutely. And hopefully, and I've heard this may happen, that hopefully some personnel person or whatever will be able to wave a magic wand and they can go back and talk to the seasonal and be able to rehire them without going through the whole process again. But again, there's no question in my mind there will be a lot of problems. And of course, I can tell you, I currently am the director of one of the Park Service seasonal law enforcement academies here in Washington. And my students right now, they're real concerned. And I've already had a number of them say, who were hoping to work seasonally for the Park Service, have already told me this is too uncertain. And they're already being looked at and being interviewed by other local law enforcement agencies, city, county, state, here in the state of Washington and elsewhere, because they just don't trust what's going on in the government right now. So I'm afraid we're going to lose even a lot of the seasonals who were offered jobs and then they were rescinded. A lot of those folks are going to say it's just not worth the risk. I'm not going to do it, which is
Yeah,
very fortunate.
yeah, pretty crazy. Now, I believe that originally law enforcement rangers were supposed to be exempt from firing, and yet I think some seasonal people who want to land seasonal jobs as law enforcement, they had their job offers rescinded. Is that correct?
That is correct. I know that for a fact because I had a number of my cadets from last fall's academy that graduated in December who wrote me here about a month and a half ago, I guess it was, in late January, saying that they received letters their jobs were rescinded, even though they were going into visitor protection positions, law enforcement positions. And then there was it's been very confusing. Nobody's been able to keep up on all the changes and things they're doing and things the administration is asking for. But they were rescinded. Then they were told the law enforcement jobs were exempt, and then of course they just said that no, now the Park Service can go ahead and hire the seasonals. So it's been very confusing for everybody. And if you're not connected with the government somehow, I don't know how you keep up with it other than in the news.
Now, earlier you had mentioned that, correct me if I'm wrong, that today there are roughly 1,200 permanent law enforcement rangers in the park system, and that's year round,
That is correct.
as opposed to 1,500 back in, what year was that? 1980. And so we've gone from roughly 100 million visitors a year to over 330 million visitors a year. Those permanent rangers, they must be under a heck of a lot of pressure right now because they're not getting those seasonal law enforcement rangers coming in when they might have expected them to show up.
That is correct. I mean, the Park Service in the summertime, the backbone is our seasonal employees who, run the entrance stations and do law enforcement work and help with search and rescue because of the vast number of visitors that come in the summertime. And yeah, we need those seasonals. The permanents, yeah, are being run ragged, to be blunt. The quality of life, I can tell you, for rangers has become very hard, very stressful. I was in Yellowstone volunteering at the National Park Ranger Museum a few years ago, and having worked there approximately 15 years before that, talking to some of the rangers that were still there, as they told me, we no longer are proactive trying to get a lot of the things we need to do done. All we are is reactive trying to deal with visitors because there's not enough of us to deal with all the issues that's going on in the park when we have, hundreds and thousands of visitors on a daily and weekly basis.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Back in January, I'd heard that at Zion National Park, I guess they rely a lot on community search and rescue professionals If there's a large search, they need to call in some help. They'll turn to those in the community who are proficient and certified. And in the past, they would pay them obviously an hourly wage to come in and help out with search and rescue. And I've heard that the park sent out an email to those personnel saying that we can't pay you, but we'd sure love it if you'd volunteer when we need you. Have you heard anything like that?
No, I have not. I have not heard that. That doesn't surprise me. And I just might say that a lot of parks depend on local volunteers. And within the government, we have the same with wildland fire. We can hire what's called AD, emergency hire folks to help out. And Yosemite depends on a lot of volunteers there from outside the park that they pay to come in and help with search and rescue. And as you mentioned, Zion. And so that's not uncommon in many parks. I know that right now the parks have really been restricted. I find it somewhat funny but tragic. Last week, the administration put a $1 limit on all government credit cards. I have to tell you, when I worked in Alaska in the 1990s and the Clinton administration allowed the government employees to start using credit cards, we saved the taxpayers throughout the government hundreds of millions of dollars. I always like to give the example very, very quickly of for me to buy a $2 screwdriver, I had to fill out a 5-page requisition form, send it to the administrative officer 500 miles away up in Glen Allen by snail mail. And then it would be, 3 months later, I'd get this $2 screwdriver. And according to some of the efficiency work done by the GSA, or by the government services or government accounting office, they said, that $2 screwdriver, just going through all the paperwork and people's time would probably cost about $65. Where once we were issued a credit card, I could walk to the hardware store next door and buy a $2 screwdriver. But unfortunately, as is the case in a lot of private business, there were some people that abused it, not so much in the Park Service, but in other government agencies. And why somebody would try to abuse the use of government credit card when there's a paper trail, I don't understand. And as a result, Congress started revoking those. 25 years ago, they started putting more restrictions on who could use those credit cards, but they make it very efficient for government employees to get work done. But now, as of last week, their credit cards are limited to a $1 purchase. So in effect, they can't travel right now. They can't buy gas in their government vehicles or anything. And so it's really put a stymie. And as you mentioned, they have basically told a lot of the volunteers they can give stipends for emergency action. They can't pay those now. One of the more tragic things I just saw this week, the current administration is recalling the GSA leases on government facilities. And what that means basically is the government, the Park Service, and we'll just talk about the Park Service, has a lot of administrative sites where they have shared visitor centers to, again, be more efficient with other federal agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. They have joint visitor centers. A lot of those are in rented buildings. The government rents, not that the government's built. And they're revoking those leases. And just as one example, down in Seattle, Klondike Gold Rush National Historic Park has a very nice museum and visitor center down there. Talk about the history of the 1898 gold rush to Alaska and what happened there in Seattle and so forth and so on. And that lease is being revoked. That visitor center and museum is visited by hundreds of thousands of people a year, and the administration has said they're stopping that lease when the lease is up, which will be sometime in the next 6 to 12 months. And we're just going to lose a museum and visitor center that hundreds of thousands of people enjoy every year. And that's going to happen throughout the country at many places.
Well, I wonder how set in concrete those plans are. If it's just something that here are the possibilities, and we'll go back and cherry pick what we really think is a waste of taxpayer dollars.
Well, I have seen a list the administration put out and said all these, and within the Department of the Interior, it's a list of over 100 places that they said as soon as the lease is over, it shuts down. And of course, many of those are the offices where people work, and the administration, of course, has said they want all their teleworkers to go back to the office. Now they're not going to have an office to go back to.
Yeah, it's a really strange strategy, if there is a strategy. And, as we mentioned earlier, reduction in force plan is still coming down the pike. I think we're going to, well, it's supposed to be submitted by March 13th, later this week. I wonder what that's going to suggest.
It's really hard to say. I mean, we've heard rumors from within the Park Service that they're going to go after what are called career conditional employees and term employees first, and then do a reduction in force. A reduction in force basically just means the government goes in and says we need to cut this many positions. And there are rules and regulations that apply to that. And so far, this administration hasn't followed a lot of the civil service rules and regulations. A RIF, there are certain rules and regulations that, the longer a person's been on, the less likely they are to be RIFed, and they have first dibs, so to speak, on other government jobs that may be coming open. So there's some protections in there for government employees, but, you know, the Park Service has lost so many employees, in the last 30 years because the budgets have never gone up because Congress just doesn't want to give money to the national parks, basically, that it's going to be hard. And I can't say what's going to happen. It's somewhat scary to think that whether we're going to have to close parks or really cut back services. I think services are going to be extremely cut back. You're going to see bathrooms closed this summer. As I've traveled around the country the last few years, where the national parks used to always have visitor centers open 7 days a week to provide services to the visitor. Many, many parks, including parks like Grand Canyon, have cut their visitor centers back to 5 days a week or less. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. The visitor services, the visitor talks by interpreters, we're going to see less and less of that as we go into the future.
It's been mentioned to me that this could be a calculated effort to really not just downsize the size of federal government, but maybe downsize the national park system. If you have a smaller unit that only has, a handful of full-time employees and depends on seasonals or whatnot, well, maybe we'll just, get rid of those positions and let a concessionaire run this park or let the gateway community run this park. Have you heard those rumors?
I have heard those rumors, and it's very sad to think about. I mean, the mission of the National Park Service is to, preserve these areas for future generations, and the mission of the National Park Service is to protect these great natural areas, and also to hold and define and interpret the history of this country to the American people, which is why we have such a diverse collection of historic sites, from presidential sites to the White House to the Statue of Liberty and all the others in between. And that's our job. And every American should be proud that we are holding those areas and defining our history and our culture to the world, not just to this country. And it would be sad if we started cherry picking, or whatever you want to call it, to say, well, we're going to close this park for economic reasons. It's sad that politicians don't see beyond the economics and see the value that these places have to the American people, and the importance that we remember our history and remember our culture. And it would just be very, very sad if they started doing that. And of course, the American people love their national parks, and I hope they would come out and let their congressmen know that we need to save these places. But yeah, there are a lot of people that you mentioned privatization. Privatization has been tried with administrations in the past, and it has been a major failure, in my opinion. In many of the parks, they've tried stuff, and the reality of it is, when you start privatizing things, it ends up costing the taxpayers more, to be honest. Like I said, park employees are some of the lowest paid federal employees, far cheaper than the private sector for the most part, from a taxpayer point of view. And also, you get less and less services. Businesses are in business to make money, and they're gonna cut what they can, and what they don't think is important or too costly, they're gonna cut that. And if you were to privatize things, you would not have nearly the service you have. Plus, I've heard over the years there's some politicians that have said, well, a family should pay the same to go into a national park as they do to Disneyland. Well, Disneyland, I don't know what price is, but it's well over $100 a day per person, if not up to 150 or $200 a day per person. Can you imagine the average family of four in this country trying to go to Grand Canyon National Park, which, as Teddy Roosevelt once said, every American should see, and they have to pay $400 or $500 for a family of four to go see it? That's just not right. That's just not right. These places belong to the American people, and they have every right to visit them and see them at all levels of, the national parks are one of the most democratic things we have in this country, in the sense that they're open to all economic levels, all people of the world, not just our country, but all economic levels. And doesn't matter if you're from a blue state, a red state, or a purple state. They're open to everybody, and they should be.
Yeah. I'm curious if we're going to see more pushback from Congress. I mean, many of these national park units, if not most of them, were created by acts of Congress. So in the past, the predecessors of the people now in Washington saw value in these places, and they thought it was worthwhile to protect them for future generations. You look at Utah, where the state tourism bureau made a huge promotional campaign of the Mighty Five. Bryce Canyon, Arches, Capitol Reef, Canyonlands, Zion National Park. They're so important to the state's image, and yet the congressional delegation has been silent on what's going on. Is that the case across most of the country?
I would say that's very true in the West, where you tend to have more conservative politicians. It's interesting if you look back in history, when Grand Canyon National Park was proposed, it was opposed by the Chamber of Commerce. It was opposed by the Republican Party. It was opposed by all the mining interests, because they looked at it as an economic thing for mining and not as a national park. And Teddy Roosevelt said, "I'm going to use my power as president under the Antiquities Act to create it as a national monument." And he did, thankfully. And then about 15 years later, Congress approved it as a national park, because only Congress can make a national park through legislation. And I don't think there's anybody in this country today who would say we should get rid of Grand Canyon National Park. I personally think I've been blessed with traveling on 6 continents, and I have yet to challenge anybody to show me something, a view greater than the Grand Canyon. I think it's the most incredible sight on the face of the globe. That's my personal feeling. But we protected that. And it's funny, you mentioned Utah. The state of Utah has fought against every national park that was created in that state. They have opposed everyone that's been created since the beginning of the Park Service. And yet it was interesting, during the government shutdown a few years ago, they offered up money to keep the parks running, because they have seen how important economically, nationwide, the parks, for every dollar it costs the government to run a park, it brings back $15 in economic value to the local community. I saw a figure recently that said, and I think this is a pretty valid figure, the national parks bring $55 billion to local economies in this country. So it's a major economic driver. And even though the states oppose this, because somehow they think it's going to get locked up and they can't use it anymore, but it turns out to be a great economic driver for local communities. And again, one of the sad things if parks were shut down or closed or temporarily or mothballed or whatever, it's not just the federal employees that are going to, lose jobs, but it's thousands of people in these small communities that run restaurants and hotels and guide services and things like that.
I think it was back during the Clinton administration in the mid to late 90s. There also was an effort to downsize this federal government. But during that time, the administration took a slower approach. I think they gave the agency heads 6 months to look through their operations and try and figure out, where there was waste or where, the beneficial work being done. I think most people would agree there's always a chance for, wasted expenditures, whether it's a private business or the federal government. It's just the approach, I think, that is being taken now that is disconcerting.
You're absolutely right. In fact, I had put something out on my Facebook page, and an old friend of mine wrote back and said, "Well, what about all the people they fired during the Clinton administration?" And I didn't reply to that. I don't like to go down the rabbit hole of Facebook, but but the reality is, when Clinton did it, they followed all the civil service regulations and laws and the RIFs and so forth. They followed those. They did ask the government to, reorganize. I can only speak for the Park Service, but we went from 10 regional offices to 7 regional offices at that time. They had a proper buyout that was guaranteed, and it was done over a period of time. So I can't remember if it was over 4 years or 8 years of Clinton's administration, but yes, he actually downsized the number of government employees by almost 10%. It was done by regulation, by law, following civil service guidelines, and fair to the employees. So it was very fair. And I saw a statistic the other day. People think the government's so bloated, but we actually have less federal employees now than we did 10 years ago. I know for a fact.
One other thing, Rick, we saw roughly 700 Park Service employees take up the administration's offer to resign now, but stay on the payroll through the end of the fiscal year, or depending on the term of their job, could be sooner than that. Is there a risk between those people who left and any upcoming reduction in force? Is there a risk to losing institutional knowledge in the Park Service?
That is a great question. I just read last night on an email I received that just in the last couple days, 3 of the higher management level folks in the Park Service have just resigned, and that number of 700 is actually, they've taken the buyout, is actually up to almost 1,000 now. And between that and the probationary employees that were fired, you're talking almost 10% of the entire Park Service staff. And we are losing tremendous institutional knowledge. A lot of the higher up managers that have 20, 30 years in are basically saying, look, I'm not going to put up with this. I don't agree with it. And are deciding to take a buyout of some type, or a retirement, or whatever it might be, or simply resigning, which is really sad, because we're going to lose tremendous institutional knowledge, not just at the high management level, but also even at the field level. A lot of these probationary employees are, new, upcoming, idealistic young rangers that, want to work for the Park Service. Some of them have been working seasonally for years. All of us in the Park Service that work in the field spent a lot of time as seasonals. I spent 3 summers in college as a seasonal at Buffalo River, Arkansas, as a winter seasonal at Petrified Forest in Arizona. 90% of us, I would say, started out as seasonals, learned the ropes, learned the job, this and that. And, fortunately, many of us were able to get permanent jobs. And so these probationary employees, even though they may have only been working for a year, many have been seasonals for years and years and years, and have tremendous knowledge that we have now lost for the National Park Service. And one of my thoughts I was going to go back to, since we're talking about the number of employees, at my academy, I always teach on about the second day of class. I teach about the history and mission of the National Park Service and Rangers. And I teach about the federal budget. And I always tell my students jokingly that after they're done, they'll know more about the federal budget than most politicians. And I've gone through and tried to research various pie charts, et cetera, Googling it. And if you break down the federal budget, what's really interesting is only 13% of the entire federal budget runs the entire government. So you could get rid of every agency of the federal government, every federal employee, and that would only amount to 13% of the federal budget. So that's not where the cuts need to be made. The reality is there are a lot of other cuts that need to be made in other places, because, again, the entire government runs on 13% of the federal budget. That's not where the problem is.
Yeah, incredible. I believe you said that you were acting superintendent at Wind Cave, I think it was.
For a short time, yes. We went
Yeah.
for 2 years when I was chief ranger there without a superintendent. We had a very good management team. The regional director said, you guys take turns being acting until we can get the position filled. And so, yeah, we would basically share that position. One management team member would be acting for 3 or 4 months, and then we'd switch to somebody else.
So if you're a superintendent today, or even worse, if you're an acting superintendent, what do you do with these cuts in workforce? How do you go into the summer months knowing today what you know?
The bottom line is we would have no choice but to cut back on visitor services. I can tell you in my early years of my career, I can remember when there were major cutbacks in the early 80s under the Reagan administration. I remember the park superintendent saying, well, we're going to cut back on everything but visitor services. And the reality was the American public didn't realize that we were being cut back because they were seeing all the services still going on and the ranger talks and the protection rangers out there doing search and rescue, et cetera. And I don't think they saw that. And over the years, we have had to cut back more and more on public visitor services, and that's basically what we're going to have to do. There's no question. We're going to have to do less talks. We're going to have to do less walks. We're going to have to clean the bathrooms less often. That's just reality. I as a part of a management team when I was at Wind Cave, 85% of our budget was fixed cost, energy, just to keep the lights on and that sort of thing. And we only had about 15% of discretionary money and that's what we used to hire seasonals and to provide toilet paper and things like that for visitor service. And those things are going to have to be cut back on is the bottom line.
What about something more drastic? And I'm thinking back to when Mike Finley was superintendent of Yosemite back in, I think it was the 90s, and he said we're going to shut the Yosemite Valley down because we just can't handle the crowds coming in. Or John Townsend at Yellowstone in the 80s, who said we're going to have to close some campgrounds because we don't have the staff or the funding. We're going to have to put off spring opening because we don't have the money to pay the snowplow operators to open up the passes. Are you hearing anything like that out there? Is Cam Shawley going to put off the spring opening at Yellowstone?
I personally have not heard anything like that. I can tell you that I worked for Finley in Yellowstone when we shut down the Norris campground in the Norris Geyser Basin, and that was a national outcry. The U.S. Congresswoman at the time, she came to visit Mr. Finley to talk to him about why they're closing down the Yellowstone, Norris Geyser Basin campground. It was a huge national issue. You might remember during the government shutdown, I can't remember the exact year, either 2010 or 2013, when the government shut down and Director John Jarvis closed all the monuments in Washington, D.C. And of course, that's right there in the face of the politicians, and there was a major public outcry over that.
He got in trouble for that.
Yeah, he did.
I remember watching the hearing when he got called in front of one of the committees, and they just berated him up and down, and he just sat there and, it is what it is.
Yeah, he once told me about that. He sat there for 5 hours. They wouldn't let him leave his chair.
Yeah.
Because they were trying to intimidate him, but he held up to it brilliantly. But yes, the parks are going to have to cut back. Because remember, again, the mission is to protect these places. Some politicians say, well, visitor services and opening to visitors is far more important than the resource. Well, if we don't have the resource, we don't have the park, and we don't have the visitors. And so our mission is to protect the resources. Again, Congress set the mission in place to protect them unimpaired for future generations. And, as I always like to say, I always put something out on my Facebook every World Ranger Day that I say 1,000 years from now, the world won't remember failed presidents, CEOs, generals, or who had the most money. But we as a people will be judged by how much of nature, wild places, and wild things we saved for those future generations.
That's Rick Mossman. He's the president of the Association for National Park Rangers. Rick, I appreciate your time today. Interesting conversation, concerning conversation. Hopefully, in the not-too-distant future, we can have a more uplifting and fun conversation.
You bet. Thank you very much. Happy to speak to you anytime.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it informative. As the transformation of the federal government continues, we'll keep you updated on the impacts to the national park system at the National Parks Traveler. For the Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.